Now I'm telling you about Jacob Javits and that specific unmed feeling of 1973 for a very urgent reason. Because as of roughly 4 hours ago, Washington has officially entered a new kind of twilight. Right now, behind closed doors on Capitol Hill, we are watching the most significant internal Republican revolt since the day Javits stood his ground against Nixon. This isn't just about a headline or a heated tweet. It is a structural collision. We have a president attempting to use permanent emergency powers to bypass the law, while members of his own party are frantically reaching for the same constitutional emergency brake that Javits built 53 years ago. We have spent years wondering if the internal guardrails of our democracy actually existed, if they were still bolted to the floor, or if they had rusted away. Tonight, we aren't wondering anymore. We are watching them being tested in real time under maximum pressure by the very people who know exactly how dangerous unchecked power can become. This is the story of the override, and you're going to want to see how the plumbing is holding up for years. The executive branch had been operating on a sort of trust me basis regarding where and when we sent Americans into combat. And Richard Nixon had taken that trust me and turned it into a secret, unauthorized bombing campaign in Cambodia. He was moving the pieces on the global chessboard, not according to a map drawn by Congress, but according to a map drawn in his own head. And Jacob Javits, a Republican, remember, decided that the map was wrong. He decided that if the President of the United States could start a war by himself, then the United States was no longer a republic. It was an autocracy with a 4-year lease. So Javits and a bipartisan group of lawmakers did something radical. They wrote the War Powers Resolution. It was a simple, elegant piece of legislative machinery. It said, "Mr. President, you can respond to an emergency, but the clock starts the second you do. You have 60 days. After that, if we don't say yes, the troops come home. The power to stay at war belongs to the many, not the one." Nixon, of course, hated it. He called it unconstitutional. He called it dangerous. And on the 24th of October, 1973, he did exactly what everyone expected. He vetoed it. Now, usually that's where the story ends. The president says no, the party stays in line, and the imperial presidency keeps on rolling. But then came the 7th of November, 1973. Imagine the mood on the Senate floor. It's cold. It's tense. The Watergate scandal is a literal weight in the room. Richard Nixon is expecting his party to hold the line. He is expecting that even if they don't like him, they will protect the office. But Jacob Javits and his fellow Republicans had reached a breaking point. They realized that loyalty to a man is not the same thing as loyalty to a system. When the vote was called, the unthinkable happened. Enough Republicans broke ranks. They looked at the veto. They looked at the secret bombings. They looked at the map, and they voted to override their own president. It was the first time in American history that Congress had successfully reclaimed its constitutional power over war. They didn't do it because they were Democrats. They did it because they realized that if the guardrails aren't bolted down, eventually the car goes off the cliff. I tell you that story from 1973, that forgotten moment of Republican spine, because of what happened in Washington late last night. Because for the first time in 53 years, that same historical machinery has just been triggered. Not by the opposition, not by the liberal media, but by a group of Republicans who have spent the last few hours looking at a map of Greenland, looking at a phone call to a colleague, and realizing that the guardrails are starting to bend. And tonight, they are finally starting to hum. Tonight, we have to talk about the plumbing. I know, it's not as exciting as a late-night tweet or a primary challenge, but in Washington, the plumbing is where the power actually lives. And right now, the pipes are screaming. The specific mechanism we are watching is Section 5B of the War Powers Resolution of 1973. Now, remember the 60-day clock we talked about in Act 1? That clock is the heart of the law. It says that if the president introduces U.S. forces into hostilities, or even a situation where hostilities are imminent, he has 48 hours to tell Congress, and then he has exactly 60 days to get a yes from them. If he doesn't, the law says he must bring the troops home. But here's the forensic reality of January 2026. The president isn't just moving troops, he is moving rhetoric. When you start talking about military force against a NATO ally like Denmark over the acquisition of Greenland, you aren't just making a real estate pitch. You are technically creating a situation of imminent hostilities with a treaty partner. And that is where the Republican revolt gets technical. Behind the scenes, senators like Susan Collins and Rand Paul aren't just concerned. They are moving a concurrent resolution. This is a specific legislative tool designed to be an emergency brake. Because it's a concurrent resolution, it expresses the will of Congress to mandate a withdrawal of forces without needing the president's signature to take effect. It is quite literally the in case of emergency break glass handle of the U.S. Constitution. But the president has a countermove, and this is where it gets dark. While the Senate was debating war powers, the White House quietly issued Executive Order 14373. It's titled Safeguarding Venezuelan Oil Revenue. But don't let the dry name fool you. By invoking the National Emergencies Act, the president has declared that the mere possibility of a court-ordered seizure of those oil assets is an unusual and extraordinary threat to national security. See what he's doing? He is using a financial emergency to create a legal shield. By declaring this emergency, he attempts to bypass the Senate's power of the purse. He is claiming that because it's an emergency, he can centralize control over billions of dollars in revenue, money that should be under congressional oversight, and use it to fund his own priorities. Effectively telling the rebel Republicans, go ahead, pass your resolution. I have the money. I have the emergency status, and I don't need your permission. It is a collision of two massive legal gears. On one side, a bipartisan group of senators trying to reshackle the war power. On the other, a president using permanent emergency as a bypass valve for the entire system of checks and balances. And at the center of this, collision. A single phone call that proves this isn't just a legal debate. It's a fight for survival. When we say the guardrails are being tested, we aren't talking about a metaphor. We are talking about a documented, recorded, and verifiable series of events that took place in the second week of January 2026. The first receipt, the Collins call. Multiple reports now confirm a high-deal phone call between the president and Senator Susan Collins following her vote to advance the War Powers Resolution. According to those familiar with the exchange, the president didn't just express disagreement. He used what has been described as profanity and political threats, allegedly telling her that loyalty to the party was a conditional requirement for his support of her committee seniority. But why the rage over a simple resolution? Because the War Powers Act is an operational reality. Once Republicans like Collins, Murowski, and Rand Paul joined Democrats in a 52-47 vote, they didn't just send a message. They triggered a legal clock that forces the administration to prove that imminent hostilities with Denmark are not being fueled by purely personal or real estate-driven whims. And that brings us to the second receipt, the stalled disclosures. For months, the administration has promised unprecedented transparency regarding the decision-making behind the Greenland annexation threats and the Venezuelan oil emergency. But look at the calendar. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has now gone public with a stinging indictment of Inspector General compliance failures. Specifically, Whitehouse's subcommittee has identified a massive gap. Over 3 million pages of records were legally due for release under the Epstein Files Transparency Act and the Presidential Records Act by late December 2025. Instead, the Department of Justice sat on them for 43 days, eventually releasing a heavily redacted wave on the 30th of January 2026, while claiming full compliance. Whitehouse is calling it a fake tip-line approach to oversight, a deliberate effort to flood the zone with redactions rather than records. And finally, the Venezuelan oil receipt. The administration claims Executive Order 14373 is about national security, but the smoking gun isn't in a speech, it's in the Treasury General License Number 46, issued on January 29th. While the president declares a national emergency to shield these assets from judicial process, his own Treasury Department is simultaneously carving out exceptions that allow multinational energy companies to engage in transactions with the very same entities the order claims are a threat. The skeptics' view is that the president is simply protecting American interests, but the documents show a different reality. By declaring the funds sovereign property 4.1, the administration is effectively using the U.S. Treasury to act as a legal shield for corporate creditors, ensuring that private parties cannot reach the money while the White House retains unitary control over who gets paid and when. This isn't just governance, it's an administrative credibility test, and according to the receipts, the administration is currently failing. We are currently living through a moment that political scientists call a systems test. And as we stand here in early 2026 with the midterms looming and the international order shuddering, we have to ask, what happens to a system when the pressure doesn't come from the outside, but from the very top of the architecture itself? This GOP revolt, we are witnessing this quiet, frantic coordination in Senate hallways, isn't just a disagreement over a map or an oil asset. It is a collective realization among Republican lawmakers that they are dealing with a brittle system. Think about that word, brittle. A flexible system can bend, it can absorb a shock, and snap back into place. But a brittle system holds its shape under immense pressure until the very second it shatters. And what these senators are realizing, perhaps belatedly, is that the imperial presidency they've tolerated or even cheered for has reached its breaking point. Because when a president suggests he is guided solely by his own judgment and not by law, treaties, or constitutional precedent, the question stops being partisan. It becomes structural. The 2026 context is this. If these internal guardrails fail now, if the War Powers Resolution is ignored, if the Emergency Act is used as a permanent bypass for Congress, then those precedents don't just belong to Donald Trump, they belong to whoever comes next. And that is the nightmare scenario, keeping Washington veterans awake at night. Today's shortcut is tomorrow's normal. We have seen this pattern before. And not just in 1973. We see it in every historical instance, where governance is replaced by spectacle and crisis language. It is a strategy of exhaustion. If every day is a breaking emergency, if every policy disagreement is sabotage, eventually the public simply stops looking. And when the public stops looking, accountability dies in the dark. But here is the hopeful part. The no we are hearing today is coming from within. It is coming from people like Susan Collins and Chris Murphy. People who may disagree on every single ideological point, but find themselves standing on the same narrow strip of constitutional ground. They're asking how to prevent irreversible damage to the institutions they still need to function after this presidency is gone. They are realizing that silence is no longer neutral, that inaction has become a form of consent. So, as we watch the headlines fade and the rage and profanity of the news cycle continues, keep your eye on the plumbing. Watch the inspectors general. Watch the statutory deadlines. Watch the senators who are quietly deciding that their legacy isn't tied to a person, but to a process. Because history doesn't remember who tweeted the loudest. It remembers who stepped in when the rules were bending past their breaking point. Democracy doesn't protect itself. It relies on people willing to defend it when it's inconvenient, when it's politically risky, and when it's most uncomfortable. The guardrails are humming, and they are being tested. The question for all of us voters, citizens, and lawmakers alike is whether we are strong enough to make them hold. Watch this space. We aren't going anywhere.